Hello and welcome to the Viking Mindset Transformational Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Thurman. I hold a master's degree in applied psychology from Walden University, as well as certifications in life coaching, clinical hypnotherapy, and the emotional freedom technique. We also call that tapping. And today we have two very, very special guests who I've been talking about collaborating with for a while. Daisy Fenton, who has the Feel the Heal with Daisy podcast, and my coworker and colleague Ashley Robinson, who also has a background in clinical psychology, almost finished with her master's degree. And today we'll talk about trauma bonding, how they come about, um, maybe a few ways to resolve that, and just other stuff. And I'll kick it off. Do y'all want to introduce yourself? Daisy, you want to say something about you and your program?
Hello, y'all. I'm Daisy. Like Hank already mentioned, I have my own coaching business. I do one on one coaching with clients that are looking to go deeper out of a clinical setting. And then I work in treatment centers with the support of clinically trained professionals, and I do somatic group facilitation. So that's where that name Feel the Heal comes from. It's all about tapping into what you're feeling in the body physically and how it's being expressed. So that's kind of my main gig.
I'm Ashley. My background is more in the clinical research setting, so I'm more interested in doing research and understanding and getting that information to therapists so that they can actually apply it in a therapy setting versus actually treating patients. So my interest is mostly the more knowledge that we have about different types of psychological traumas or disorders. The more information we have, the better we can apply that. So mine is more just the research background.
Cool. Um,
Amazing.
I'm one of these people. I believe that, and I'm never for government intervention per se, but I've always felt like most of the problems that we have stem from early attachments to primary caregivers. And I'm of the belief that if someone has an anxious attachment style or even disorganized, that makes them a lot more susceptible to being trauma bonded. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of different types of trauma bond. There's an abandonment trauma bond, fawning, emotional neglect, control, and then Stockholm syndrome, which a lot of people are familiar with that. That's actually a type of trauma bond as well. So most of that stems from abandonment, and fawning specifically stem from people that have CEN or childhood emotional neglect. So they really seek that, especially in the first stage, which is love bombing. They really attach to someone that is loving them, that all that oxytocin happening in their brain, it feels good. But a lot of that does stem from the fact that they didn't get that as a child, so they're getting it now, and they just are way more susceptible versus somebody who had a healthy childhood or who has a healthy attachment style.
Cool. How would that present itself in someone's body? How would they feel it? Do you know, other than just the emotional stuff, the anxiety and that type thing?
Well, my answer would be when we are looking at people and their relationship to their body, anxiety presents itself differently. But usually, when someone has that anxious attachment or they have a tendency to fawn, people please, it's unique to each individual. So what I've found is there's our bodies replay stories over and over and over, and a lot of times the sensory experience becomes a terrifying place to live. And even individuals who don't have that healthy attachment, a lot of times what we look at in polyvagal, the ventral state, which is that physiological state of feeling safe and connected. When you have developmental trauma or attachment trauma, you even learn, your brain learns that it's not even safe to be in that state. So a lot of times in the somatic aspect of it, it's about helping individuals learn the different physiological states, what they feel like when you're in that anxious state, trying to develop a relationship with that ventral state. So, a state that feels safe and connected. And for some, like I said, that have developmental trauma, they they have to relearn how to feel safe in their bodies. So I guess it's a very generalized question because the sensory experience is so unique to each individual, and it's a unique process of trying to familiarize yourself with those somatic cues.
I think when there's early trauma like that, I think basically there's a separation in mind and body, correct? And you don't feel anything. You become numb. Is that am I correct there?
I would say there yes and no to that for me, because from my experience working with clients, being numb is a feeling. So learning that if you're experiencing numbness, that is a mechanism of the body. It's a mechanism of your physiological experience. And so that's what we start working with first is connecting with that numbness. What would
Okay,
you
I
say,
got you.
Ashley?
Yeah, I would say there's something that happens within a trauma bond that when you talk about that numb for me, when I look at things like that, and I love the somatic approach because when I look at it as there are no really such thing as emotion. All of the emotions that you feel are chemicals in your brain. So if you're feeling nothing, that is a lack of chemicals or too much of one chemical or nothing in your brain. And there's I mean, you have to learn how to regulate that or do things with your body so that your body naturally re-regulates it. When you leave or walk away from a trauma bond situation, it's like recovering from drug addiction. Um,
Mm.
so the first thing that happens to your body is something called, now Hank, you know I'm from Mississippi, so I'm going to pronounce this the best way I can. It's called hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis stress syndrome, or HPA. So what that means is the oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin levels in your body, as well as the cortisol levels in your body, are all out of balance, out of whack, completely. But that's the same thing that happens to your brain when you are recovering from heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, or any type of drug. Mostly heroin, alcohol, and cocaine are the biggest ones where we see that same hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis stress syndrome. So there's a lot of words. HPA is the easier thing to say. But the other thing that happens in a trauma bond that doesn't happen with drug addiction is social stress syndrome. So those cortisol levels, the lack of oxytocin, the lack of dopamine. So that's why a lot of times people keep going back or ignore the negative part or that numbness because they're addicted. They want that dopamine. They need it. And it actually changes the neural pathways in your brain to need it more. So it can be physically painful to the body to leave and
Mm.
walk away. Sorry if I went
Mm.
off on a little bit of a
Oh,
tangent there.
no, that's
No,
great
oh my,
stuff.
wow.
Yeah, that's. I mean, you see why I wanted to bring her on here, Daisy. I mean, it's brilliant.
Well, it's incredible to understand the. I love learning about the science of these things, especially because you're bringing in the brain chemistry with it. And I'm in recovery myself, and I see this all the time. A lot of
I am too.
recovering addicts have, what's called in the recovery groups as love addiction, and
Hmm.
it's the way I witness it is like these people are in survival because your brain is actually telling you like I need this connection to
Absolutely.
survive. And I even just personal experience, I remember going through a separation, and for the first couple months being in a new environment after that, I had to just take baths because my body was in so much pain. And you just
Hmm.
kind of put the science to that experience, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that tied everything together right there with me. I'm in recovery myself and have been for several years now, and I think I think I think, when we're small and we don't get what we need, we become codependent because, you know, love is
Mhm.
kind of a transactional deal where, you give to get. You see what I'm saying? And people become codependent. And I think that just, gets everything out of whack, and it makes people a lot more susceptible to being trauma bonded. Would you agree with that, Ashley?
Yes, absolutely. And especially, I know I'm someone that suffers from ADHD. I know you are too. And on top of the transactional type of love, which would really fall into probably the abandonment type of trauma bond. But on top of that, you and I are both even more susceptible because of our neurodivergence. So neurodivergent people
Mm.
who hyperfixate anyway, who already can't regulate their dopamine levels, are fall more victim because when they get into a relationship with someone who is narcissistic, or sometimes people, it's not always narcissism. Sometimes people don't realize that's what they're doing because they have childhood
Yeah.
trauma, and then the abused becomes the abuser. There's a saying that I like: hurt people hurt people.
Hmm.
And a lot of times they're not doing it on purpose, but as neurodivergent, you hyperfixate and then you get super even more attached. Well, your brain already doesn't regulate those chemicals. So now you're really on a roller coaster. It also makes you, I mean, neurodivergent people are also more susceptible to addiction, whether that be caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, anything that you can become addicted to. You're more susceptible because you can't regulate that. But on the flip side of that, which I think is important to look at with trauma bonds, is that in neurodivergent people, we hyperfixate. So on the subject that probably nobody else cares about, we could talk about it for hours, and we research it for hours, and we're just hyperfixated on that one subject. But we also do that with people. So if we meet someone and we just think they're the greatest thing since Betty White and sliced bread, then we can hyperfixate on them, and it can look like or present itself as the first stage of a trauma bond, which is love bombing, because they are just giving us all of this dopamine and all of this. And this person might be a healthy relationship person, but we are doing the hyperfixating and looking like love bombing and just overly way too much. And some people can think, oh my gosh, well, this is like the beginning stages of a trauma bond. And it's certainly not. It's just the beginning stages of hyperfixation. So being able to know whether your patient is neurodivergent in and their experiences are going to be vastly different from someone who's neurotypical. So am I making sense there?
You're making perfect sense.
Yes, that actually brings up a question for me. So, does the neurodivergency of like something like ADHD, is that a result of trauma or attachment trauma, or is that come before?
Absolutely can be. So ADHD can be something that you develop in childhood just because how you're born. They like to link it to parents who maybe drank or smoked while they were pregnant with a person. Like you can develop it just like autism. There's no real known um, cause, but I do believe, and this is just theory. I don't have any research to back this up, just my own and different papers and things that I've read. I do believe that it can be developed out of trauma because trauma alters your brain chemistry so much that I think if you are in a state of depression for so long that you're not getting enough dopamine, that your body doesn't remember how to produce it. So then you develop ADHD because that's the majority of what ADHD is the body's inability to regulate dopamine. So if you're not getting it for a long period of time because you've stayed in a trauma response, whatever your trauma response is, and you stayed in that fight or flight, producing more cortisol than dopamine, then I feel like it's entirely possible for your body to become used to that and that to be the normal state for you, and then develop something like ADHD. But like I said, that's simply theory. I don't have science to back that up.
Makes sense though.
Hmm. It makes sense in
That
my
makes sense.
mind.
It does in
Oh
mine
yeah,
too.
Yeah.
I and even one of my favorite guys, out there is Gabor Mate, and he talks about he has the same theory, or he presents that same information, that ADHD is really this fluctuation in the nervous system that's, going into two different survival states constantly. So that's really, really interesting. As someone I consider myself to be really holistic, and I think that's probably why I love somatic work so much, because it really is about us using our bodies to help form new neural pathways and connect with, the firing mechanisms, disrupting ones. But what would you say, what would you offer someone like me that is really tries to lean more towards a holistic approach? Um, but if you're saying there's these chemical imbalances in the brain, is there often the approach that you need to address that with medication?
I think it's to each their own, to be honest. And I think it depends. It's very dependent on your support system and the safety of the area. If you're in an area that is unsafe and you need help very quickly, obviously medication is going to be the fastest pathway for that. But if you're in a mid state or a safe enough environment, and because I prefer holistic, I think understanding which brain chemicals are disrupted is the best thing. And a lot of that with a psychology background, once you know that, you can pretty much pinpoint, like knowing what your symptoms are and say, okay, well, this, chemical is responsible for this chemical is responsible, this is what's happening. So these are the ones that are disrupted. Otherwise, or you could go to a psychologist that specializes in that, or holistic hormone homeopathic. I can't think of the name. There's one lady in Nashville, and I wish I would have written it down. I knew I was going to forget. That does that pulls your blood and tests your thyroid and all of the chemicals that are in your body and where you have. At that point, you can do your research. Most of the information is available on Google. You can do your research on what foods to eat, on different yoga poses that help release the cortisol, or that can help you balance that. And you can change your entire lifestyle, you can change your diet. I know Hank is not a vegetable guy anymore, but I do know that there are certain plants and certain things that have been used for hundreds of years in Eastern medicine that help regulate, and I think it's actually growing. The popularity of that is growing a lot more. And there's also, because I believe in the holistic side of it too, there's also things that are only legal in a couple of states right now that help, certain type of microdosing mushrooms and things like that have been proven to help people with PTSD and other trauma stuff. I've got a very good friend of mine that I was in the military with, who has severe PTSD, and he lives in Oregon where it's legal, but he has a shop that he goes to, and they pack it into a little capsule, and it's mushrooms that are microdosing. He takes it like a medication, and it's helped him tremendously. No more flashbacks, no more nightmares. His anxiety levels have gone down. He was pre-diabetic. That has completely gone away without much weight loss. He is a heavier set guy. Like there's so much research backed on the holistic approach. So that's what I would say to that. I think it would be to each their own. Like it depends on your situation, what you believe in, and what you want, what you're wanting out of it, because the holistic approach is going to take a little bit longer and a lot more work on your part.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now they were doing this study with ecstasy and PTSD here a few years ago, weren't they? Over in North Carolina.
Yes.
I haven't seen any more about it. Do you
I
know
haven't
any
either. The problem with ecstasy is that you're trading one addiction for another, pretty much, because ecstasy releases that dopamine in your brain, but it floods your brain with dopamine. That's why people take it for a rave, and it's very associated with like erratic sexual behaviors too, because you're not only getting a flood of dopamine, but you're getting a flood of oxytocin as well. So you are just in happy land. It's impossible to be sad. I wouldn't be speaking from any kind of personal experience at all, I promise. But
That's one I never did. That's probably one of the few I missed.
yeah,
Oh gosh.
only once for me, but you get a flood, like it's impossible. Like literally somebody could walk up and punch you in the face and you'd be like, thank you. Like you'd be like, hey, hope you're having a great time too.
That's
So you're
spiritual.
just,
right?
yeah, you're just trading one addiction for another. And if you're microdosing it, I think anything that you're going to take to heal should be something non-habit forming, so that you're just not trading and
Yeah.
addictions, because at that point you're just juggling addictions.
Yeah, don't need any more of that.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, most of my research that I've done and papers I've written have involved cluster B personalities. And when we talk about trauma bonding, it's like they can smell someone who is codependent from a mile away, like like a shark smells blood in the water, and it's like they know exactly what to do. They get them good and addicted, then they pull away. Then they
Mhm.
use intermittent reinforcement to just screw up the brain chemistry and just get them addicted like that. And it's all deliberate. Um,
Mm.
and you could you talk more, Ashley, about the people who aren't deliberate doing it? Neurotypical.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, those people who aren't deliberate are usually, that's a learned behavior in childhood. So they probably, most likely, I'm not going to say, there's always exceptions to the rule, but those are people that probably grew up with a manipulative or narcissistic parent. And
Like you and I.
they did not realize it, but they mimic those behaviors because they too have abandonment issues or trauma, or they're the victims of a trauma bond. So therefore they recreate it.
Wow.
So it's kind of hard to say that person is a narcissist, because they actually are just mimicking narcissist behaviors because they don't know any different. And their trauma bond with this person is their way of like making sure that they're not going to leave, but they can't regulate their own emotions or have never seen healthy emotional regulation. So I think there are instances where people are doing it. And a good way to know that is if someone does seek out therapy and they are worried that maybe they've seen it on TikTok. I talked with a friend of mine who is a psychologist recently, had a patient who came in and was worried that she was the problem. And she was like, I learned this on TikTok. I feel like I'm doing this in my relationship. My gosh, am I a narcissist? And a good way to know is if you're wondering if you are the narcissist, you're probably not.
You're not.
Yeah. So you are probably just mimicking your childhood behavior. So at that point, it would be really, really important to explore your childhood traumas and healing that first before you enter in a relationship with somebody else. And if you're already married or in a relationship that you don't want to get out of, then definitely couples therapy and healing that childhood inner trauma and working on making that better would be your first bet. And then if you're somebody who's doing it intentionally and you're doing it intentionally, seek help. I mean, I don't hate anyone, but you just,
I do.
it's, yeah. There's 5 stages of trauma bonding, like how it happens and how it forms. The first stage is love bombing, which we all know, what that is. That's when somebody forms, they're in love with you very early on, day 2, day 3, and they form an idea of you in their head that is this like perfect, idealistic, and you will never live up to that. You will never be that perfect thing. So at that point, the stage 2, which is they develop dependence and trust. They want themselves to be the only person that you can come to feel safe. And they tend to isolate you. They will talk bad about your friends, and it'll be subtle at first, so that you start to look at your friend group differently, or and you're only dependent upon them. And then the third would be criticism. So this is the point where you are not living up to that idealistic version of you that they've created in their head. And they start to criticize little things about you, like you talk too much, or you do this or you do that that gets on their nerves, and it'll be small and joking at first, and you're like, oh yeah, I do that, like, and it's very, very slow. Then they will start to gaslight you. That's step 4, gaslighting and manipulation, to where you're questioning your own thoughts, like, did I leave the door unlocked? Did I forget to turn the dishwasher on? Did I and like, you think you're going crazy, but you've already gone back to that stage 2 where you're dependent upon this person, so you already trust and believe that they're telling you the truth. 5 is control establishment. At this point, the narcissist or the abuser knows they have full control over you. 6 is your loss of sense of self. So you have lost completely control of you're 1,000% dependent on this person. And then 7 is obsession. And that is the full circle where your brain is now completely addicted. That's that first shot of heroin, that, 1 sip of alcohol, your addiction is fully formed, your neural pathways are fully changed. And now to break away from it is going to require work, real actual work. And this can happen in as quickly as 3 to 4 months in a relationship. And then it actually, with people who are neurodivergent or have anxious, disorganized attachment styles, this can happen as quickly as a month or 2, which that's scary for me, that within a month you can become addicted to another human to the point where it's hard for you to walk away. So that's yeah.
You would call that undue influence,
mm-hmm.
if it's done deliberately.
Right.
And I'm curious too, because just listening to you say this, I think there's a lot of people, and I know people that, will probably be listening to this. The attachment styles is kind of common information now. A lot of people are identifying with different attachment styles, and they identify of, oh, I'm more, anxious, or I'm more avoidant. And, it seems like opposites attract a little bit in the attachment
Mm-hmm.
styles. So it's interesting, because I wonder if you could kind of put it into context in a way it's not necessarily like this outward abuser, but maybe 2 dysfunctional individuals, or 2 individuals that do have a history of dysfunction and trauma, that aren't necessarily, intentionally doing these things, but maybe even they show up and they meet each other and they're somewhat healthy. They've been doing some inner work on themselves, but then you kind of start to unconsciously go into this autopilot mode of how you were raised or experiences you had in your early attachment. So what would you have to say on that?
I think that is something that happens a lot more often than we think, because I think there's so much, we don't talk about it enough, but there is so much childhood trauma. And even if you think you had great, wonderful parents, let's say you had the idealistic or the picture perfect, your parents are still married, you grew up in a loving household, but maybe their expectation of you was higher than that. Maybe they didn't understand your attachment style. And so you end up with some form of trauma or some form of emotional neglect, even though your parents were amazing. And they didn't, you didn't have a narcissistic parent. And so.
Oh, man.
It was just getting juicy. We'll see if she comes back in.
Being able to take it. Did I freeze?
Yes, you froze for a second.
Okay, was I still talking, or did it stop? I just stopped the video.
No, we couldn't hear you. So
you were just saying
like the perfect family, like everyone has some level of trauma, because I'm sure at some point in their development their needs weren't being met, or their expectations of them as a child were too high, or whatever the case may be.
Right. And that's just one example, but there's some need or some emotional thing there that's missing. So when you enter in a relationship, that's what the piece that you're trying to fulfill. And while you may think you're healthy and your partner is healthy and everything is going great, there is a certain level of unhealthy connection there, because both of you are probably trying to fill a void that you didn't even realize you had. So I think just really focusing in on yourself and learning who you are and how you feel before you jump into a relationship is extremely, extremely important.
Wow, wow, there's a guy that I follow on social media, and he talks more about like the spiritual aspect of connection. And one of the things he is always saying is intimacy is naturally going to expose your wounds. And I love that because
Yes.
it's also like the blessing and the curse of intimate relationships is it's going to be a mirror always of that those deep wounds. It's going to naturally come out. It's just more kind of how you choose to
Mhm.
consciously navigate them with your partner and maybe even, professional help.
And I think a lot of times we're sold this idea, even from young children with the media and movies and books that we read, love stories, all of this. We're sold this idea that real love or relationship is supposed to be this wildly up and down roller coaster, this fight, you should fight for love. And we're given that idea that that's so romantic to have to fight for it, or, you know, you know, just this crazy roller coaster up and down. And that's actually inaccurate. That's trauma bonding, the up and down the roller coaster. That and healthy love is actually very boring. Healthy love is, hey, I have a problem. This is an uncomfortable conversation. Can we sit down and can we talk about it? And then you talk about it without judgment of the other person. And it's just like, there's no roller coaster up and down. There's obviously arguments and disagreements, but then they're handled, as you and I against the problem versus you and I against each other. And that's boring to most people because it's not the up and down. It's not the crazy roller coaster ride. It's the kiddie park versus the fun rides. And I think, but in society, we're literally raised to believe that that's how it should look. So when we get into relationships like that, we're like, oh, this is normal. Oh, this fighting back and forth and them acting crazy and then doing all this. Or me, sorry, excuse me, me crying all the time. That's normal because people fight in relationships, but it's not, and that's not healthy or normal at all.
Well, in the road
Yeah.
less traveled,
Sorry,
in the road less traveled, Scott Peck talked about real love is the ability to live without each other, but deciding to live with each other, to stay.
mm-hmm. Choosing it.
Yeah,
I think a
exactly.
lot of people confuse love with limerence, and limerence is the what I like to call the honeymoon phase in a relationship. You get in a new relationship, you got all the butterflies. This person is just fantastic, and your oxytocin, your dopamine, and your serotonin levels rise, and you just want to do everything with this person, and it's great. You might not necessarily love bomb them, but that's how you feel. It's how you both feel. It's the honeymoon phase,
Hmm.
and that lasts typically 6 months to a year, depending on who you are, and it's very individualistic. And then when that goes away or that starts to taper down, then at that point, if you're still with that person, you still love that person, then it's a choice. To me, real love is a choice. you know you can't stand the fact that and I'm going to do this from a woman's perspective, but you can't stand the fact that he puts his clothes next to the laundry basket, he snores all night long, he never, it takes him 6 months to get his honeydew list done, and there's all of the stuff that drives you crazy. But you look at that person, and you know what, despite all of that, I choose to love you, because there's no more chemical imbalance happening keeping you attached to that person. You're choosing it. And to me, real love can't start until limerence ends. So, but that's my own theory there. I know that's
I think
a
it's
shared
smart.
theory. It's not individualistic to me, but it's yeah, I think that was it. My ADD is like my thoughts are going.
I think this is really powerful for people listening to, just because, with social media and everyone's different information that's coming out, it can be really confusing. And we already live kind of in a culture that pathologizes everything. So it's hard for people when they're in, like you're saying, relationships are hard sometimes because it's a conscious choice to love someone and to love them through their wounding and their traumas. And so it's, I think people, when they're struggling or suffering in a relationship, it's really easy to jump to this conclusion of like, oh, I'm dating a narcissist, oh, they have
Oh,
trauma,
yes.
oh, and then it gets to this extreme. Or you get to the extreme, like you were talking about that one client who was like, I must be a narcissist, and kind
Mhm.
of learning how to like take this information, absorb it, but then really integrate it in a way that's like, maybe I'm not made full in a full trauma bond, but there is trauma that we're navigating here, and there is, childhood mechanisms that are here.
Right. And I have personally, there's a lot of false information that is out there, and I see it on TikTok all the time. And, it's like you see a video of somebody saying they're a psychologist, and then they say something that is so vastly inaccurate. And I'm like, people are listening to this and people believe what you're saying. And this, I feel like psychiatrists and psychologists are going to see an influx over the next few years of people who are TikTok diagnosed or Google well, probably more because TikTok's becoming so more popular, and have made up their minds about things. And so then they're going to have to heal from that. But I'm going to use my own personal, I'm in a new relationship now. It's about 2 months into this relationship, and we totally love bombed each other, both of us. We are both neurodivergent. So what we did was hyperfixate on each other. And me being someone who has this background, and I have a lot more trauma background than he does. I mean, he has trauma as well from past relationships, abandonment, cheating, things like that, that create our what we call being jaded is actually a trauma response.
Right.
But we hyperfixated on one another very quickly. And so in my mind, because I have now learned so much, when I enter into a relationship, I learn to pick up on these things very quickly. Hold on, I'm frozen. Am I still clear?
We
So I'm
Yep,
like,
you're
okay,
coming
that was,
back.
that was, key number one, is that we were super into each other very, very quickly. And so the key to understanding the difference, and I think this is extremely important too, especially if you're someone who's aware of trauma bonding and the steps and stuff like that, but even if you're not, is consistency. So I realized early on too, because you can usually tell, especially if you have ADHD, it's almost like you're magnetized to other people with ADHD. You just kind of find each other. But you recognize some of it. And I was like, okay, well, that's both of us here. And what we're doing is hyper fixating on one another versus, and it's still a version of love bombing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to change that. But the difference is consistency. So we were both consistent. We were both open about it. We both were able to communicate that and then move along to, the next step. But you do have to be careful with hyperfixation in relationships too, because just like with anything with ADHD, I'm going to use, again, personal experience. Like I'll get interested in a craft or a new something, and I want to do this craft or whatever. And I will get all of the things to do this craft. I will do it one time. I'll put it aside and I will never look at it again because now my need has been fulfilled and I don't care. I'm on to the next thing I'm hyper fixating on, which is a normal, typical ADHD thing. Well, you can do that with people too. So if you hyper fixate on this one person way too much to the point where your need becomes fulfilled, then you start to get bored in a relationship. People talk about oh, my relationship is boring. I'm bored in my relationship. Well, that boredom part is the part where you have to, figure out if you actually care about this person or love this person, or if you were just really hyper fixated on them. Which when you're both doing it and can understand it and talk about it, that's a great thing. When the other person is on the other side of that, or you're hyper fixated on them, then it becomes a trauma bond for them, because now you've love bombed them and you've done all of this, and now you're bored. Now you're bored and you don't want them anymore, and now they don't understand why you don't, and you don't either, because you don't understand what's going on in your mind.
That's like young talked about, until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll guide your life and you'll call it fate.
1,000%. 1,000%.
Yeah.
Wow. I think it's interesting too, just the idea, because I know I struggled with this for a long time. So hopefully it helps anyone who's listening. But because I kind of, I've always been labeled as ADHD or neurodivergent, and my inability to regulate my emotions always presented as this outward reactivity of
Hmm.
an unable to regulate, where uh, I found that naturally the opposite of that was attracting partners that were inwardly unable to regulate their emotions. So that looked like pulling back and avoiding.
Hmm.
And I always thought, oh, they're so calm, they're so collected, like I'm the problem. When really I realized what I was identifying, or I kept labeling, I kept telling myself the story that I'm in a healthy relationship because it's boring. It really was actually a relationship where conflict wasn't addressed in healthy ways because it was always avoided. It always triggered that abandonment more because there was more withdrawn behavior.
Hmm.
And then it just, the dust would settle, and then I'd go, oh, well, this is boring. It's not like past, experiences where it's two reactive parties.
Right.
So
Hmm.
I think it's important that people understand that too, that, shutting, like chronic shutdown, or people constantly shutting down and then not addressing conflict in relationships, is also a form of not being able to regulate your emotions.
Right. It's just poor emotional intelligence there. And usually that stems, I mean, most of all of this goes back to childhood trauma, because that stems from, maybe one or two times they did express their emotions and they were met with resistance, or not, their need wasn't fulfilled of that, or they're told that. This happens a lot. That's why you see a lot more avoidant men. Um,
Yeah.
because they cry or they get upset and they're told, men don't cry, boys don't cry, suck it up, be a man, grow up, all of this stuff. And so they learn that over time, that's not okay. Like, I can't react to this, or I don't feel anything for this because I'm a man, and that you've been told that your entire life. So you'll
Yeah.
see a lot more avoidant attachment in men than you'll see in women, and a lot more anxious attachment, because women, we're told always, oh, honey, it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel that way. And then we then become overly emotional about stuff because we're raised the entire time that it's okay for us to be that way. And then, so you've got two different dynamics here in how you raise children. And then you expect these children to grow up and get married and have healthy family lives when they're literally, Venus and Mars, the old cliche there.
Interesting. So someone who is more avoidant, or kind of pulls back, or maybe numbs out, and it's not like they're consciously doing it, but there's this mechanism of numbing. What did you say again about the chemical? Because you just said it's poor emotional intelligence, but is there a chemical factor in all of that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So that is usually their oxytocin levels. Their oxytocin. The best way to describe oxytocin for those that don't know, or those listening that don't know, oxytocin is our bonding hormone. It is the hormone. It's the same exact hormone that women produce when they give birth. It is responsible for your connection with your baby. So this thing that just caused you immense pain coming out of your body, you're instantly in love with it because your brain floods with oxytocin. So the oxytocin also happens in relationships too, and the amount of it that you get from relationships. So if your oxytocin levels are not regulated, and you're in a relationship that should be making you feel good, because the closer you get to this person, the more oxytocin levels should go up. If they're
Mhm.
not, if that's not happening in your brain, you're not going to be bonded with this person, no matter what your other thoughts are, or what you're saying, or what your other thoughts, or what your other emotions are. You simply will not bond with the person that you're in the relationship with, because of your brain's inability to produce oxytocin, which can happen from that same childhood trauma or emotional neglect.
Wow.
With that being said, do you think that might be the root cause of people who are psychopathic?
I think I, I don't know if it's a root cause, but I think that it does play a role because it is also one of the chemicals in your brain that is responsible for empathy
Well, see, conscience is,
and being able to bond with other humans. Like if you have no oxytocin, bonding with other humans is almost impossible for you. So therefore caring about other humans is impossible for you.
well, see, Martha
Wow.
Stout said that, conscience is an intervening sense of obligation or restraint that's rooted in emotional attachments. It just
Mhm.
kind of, that what you said just kind of made me wonder.
I do think the lack of oxytocin, this is also theory and a slightly off subject, but I'll just say it. The lack of oxytocin is also the root cause of postpartum depression and why you end up with that. And I think, and it's not studied at all. The women are just diagnosed as depressed and their oxytocin levels are not measured currently. And I went in a whole paper on this too, on postpartum of oxytocin and postpartum.
You and
But
I
like I
talked
said, I know
about
that's a
that
little
more
off.
at work.
Yeah, I know that's a little off subject, but it's
I was gonna I was gonna say this could be a whole nother episode because
right.
I mean my like there's so much I would want to dive into on that just because of my own personal birth story with my son and the postpartum experience that I had because wow.
And
But
because and that's crazy too because you have talked about some personal experience with traumatic relationships. Your oxytocin levels might not be regulated, and even though when you had your child or when you gave birth, because you've already experienced those traumas, and I'm not I don't know about your childhood. I don't want to assume there, but if there was any traumatic experience there, childhood trauma, it already affected your ability to regulate oxytocin, and therefore when you gave birth, your brain might, if you did suffer from PPD, your brain might have not produced enough at the time of giving birth for you to be able to do that because it's protecting you. I mean, your brain at this point, you're in survival mode, so it's still protecting you. You're like, no, wait, we released too much oxytocin. We ended up with a traumatic experience. We're not going to do that again because your body doesn't know the difference between your baby and another person. It just knows what the chemicals are. It's, it's non-biased. It's neither good nor bad.
that's really interesting to even think about, clients that I work with that have a lot of developmental trauma and trying to help them feel like get into that state of being connected and bonded because like you're saying it triggers that trauma again. So then it probably fluctuates the chemicals in your brain of, wait, we're not safe to connect or we're not safe to
Right.
bond. And that's definitely something that, is the big piece that you're constantly navigating and healing trauma in that way is kind of that pendulum of feeling bonded and connected, pulling back, going back in and out.
And you would have a lot more experience than I would on the somatic part of that. But so I wouldn't even know where to begin on how to heal that somatically as far as what you do. Mostly I would think um, it would probably start with your diet to help because there are foods and plants and things like that that can help regulate that. But I would be really interested to find out or to know, if what somatic things can be done to help increase those chemical levels, the oxytocin levels, the dopamine levels, on like what it does and um, how to increase that in your body naturally. I would be extremely interested to know that.
Yeah, that I'm sure they're doing more and more studies because I know that, started doing studies on, like you said, yoga and the posturing and how those create different chemical. I don't study the chemical effects of different somatic work. I do more of the practical aspect, I guess. But it is super interesting now that we're on that conversation. And
I think it would be great
um,
to know. I think it would be great to
mhm.
know, and not only you're healing, and this is how I'm healing you, but this is also or this is also why it's healing you. Like, I'm healing you with this particular body movement or this particular breathing technique, or, I'm not as educated on the somatic part, so if I get that wrong, forgive me. We're doing this, and this is why it's healing you. This is how, and this is why it's healing you. And that way you could, be able to adjust accordingly.
Absolutely.
Just based on the results that you're getting from it. I've seen videos. I don't know if you've seen these. I've seen videos of people of somatic healing, and they're like maybe bent on their side, and sometimes they're in like a body of water or something, and you've got the therapist there helping them, and they just like have complete breakdowns where the stress and the trauma is releasing from their body, and they can't keep together. And I always think that those are just amazing to watch. Like, that's because you can physically see the body relax and the stress release and all of that as they completely break down. And I don't know if you've seen the same ones, but like when I see them, I'll get down the rabbit hole of like, man, this is so powerful.
Yeah, I witness that in my groups, all the time.
It's amazing.
And it's amazing when it happens even in a group setting, because you have to feel safe to have a breakdown like that. And that's oftentimes after, when I have to stay after group and help co-regulate a little bit. But I guess I haven't gone down, like, now this is kind of, I'm like, okay, the ADHD hyperfixation is going to kick into gear now, and I'm going to start going down the chemical path of somatic work, because I've been nerding out over the polyvagal and somatics, and I did a really like a 60-hour training of somatics in different avenues of it. So yeah, I'm probably going to go down a whole nother rabbit hole with this.
Yeah, I am too. I'm fascinated by the brain chemicals and stuff. That just mind
And
blowing.
it's empowering for clients too, what I found, because I do work with a lot of addicts, and um, there's a lot of, like, addiction, the root of it, a lot of it is shame. And on an emotional level, it's shame. And a lot of programs that are out there, they're really helpful, but they lack the language to help people understand their behaviors and their behavioral patterns. And so I found, when I tell people, when I educate addicts of like what trauma looks like, what does survival feel like in our bodies, there's language in other literatures that the spiritual programs that they practice, that to them it's almost like a flaw of their character, when really it's like, no, this is a survival mechanism that once served you. And so when I give them the language and help them connect with the sensory aspect of it, they start to work with it versus against it, and they stop shaming themselves, and they get more curious about themselves, which in somatic work, that curiosity is like the foundation of doing somatic work. Is you have to be curious about what you're feeling and experiencing in your body. And so I love the why, yeah,
I love
it's definitely empowering to know. And so yeah, like I now I'm like, I want to offer them even more of, hey, this is what's happening in your brain.
Self-awareness, I feel like, is one of the most empowering things. So for me personally, why I'm on the clinical research side versus the patient care side, is because I'm neurodivergent in two ways. I have ADHD, and I'm also on the autism spectrum. Not very high on the autism spectrum, but there's a lot of social situations or emotions that people will have or experience around me, and I don't understand it. I can't relate because of the autism side of my neurodivergence. I can come across as very cold, but mostly it's just very educational. Like, these are the facts, and there's no dispute in the facts unless you can prove the fact otherwise, and then at which point we reach a new fact. But there's not a lot of gray area in my mind. And of course, I know that's true. Like, I've learned that there is gray area. But in my mind, it's mostly functions in black and white facts versus that's not a fact. So that was why, I had a professor when I was in college that is almost the exact same way. He seemed very cold. If you were late to class because whatever, or if you were experiencing some kind of emotional, he was just like, okay, well, this is what you're experiencing. This is the fact, but you still have to, and you still have to turn this. I don't care. Like, he just was very, very, very cold. But he was the one. He was the reason that I went into the chemical part and understanding the brain, because he did not believe emotions exist at all. There are no such thing as emotions. What creates emotions? Emotions are all survival, human survival. If you take morality away from human beings and look at us just as animals, mammals, what we are, emotions are our survival, and they are chemical reactions in our brain and nothing more. And that, which I don't fully believe that either, because I'm a human who has human experiences and feels emotions. But I always go back to that whenever I'm reacting to something or whatever. It's like, okay, is this real, or is this my brain trying to protect me for something? And when you get into trauma situations, all of that gets jacked up. So your survival responses are messed up because of the experiences that you've had. Am I making sense there? I know it was a kind of a long way to get there, but like, if you had no trauma at all, if you took a human being and they never had any type of trauma, and they were like Mowgli growing up in the jungle where your core thing is just to survive, then your responses would function the way they should. But because you're a human that lives in this world that we live in right now, you're going to experience some type of emotional trauma, and your emotional responses are there to protect you. Unfortunately, they can be protecting you in the wrong type of ways. But when you can understand that, and I think this will help too in the somatic aspect, when you understand that your responses are there to protect you, and you can say, okay, thank you, but I don't need that type of protection. I'm going to take control here and think logically and take control. I think, honestly, without medication, without all of the extra stuff, you can retrain your brain to respond the way you want it to. Your brain believes what you tell it, and you're controlled by your subconscious mind. So if you're telling yourself something enough, whatever it may be, that's why affirmations work. It's the science behind affirmations. If you're telling it enough, you can actually recreate or create a whole neural pathway in your brain that works for you versus against you.
Absolutely. It's
Sorry, that was a really long
interesting.
way to say one thing.
No,
But
I love that you said that, because, that's one of the things I bring up in my somatic work is I just say, your emotions from a somatic perspective are just a pattern of sensory experiences in your body. So maybe your heart rate starts going up, maybe you start perspiring, and starting to identify when you're claiming grief, well, what is that? What's in your body? How is that landing in your system? And there's, this saying, feelings aren't facts. And I don't like it, but I'm always like, feelings are actually very informational. They're not factual, but they're information, and they're telling us something. But the narratives we create about them are what's not factual. And so, kind of like you said, you can retrain yourself to have a different relationship with, the feelings that you're having and what they mean for you. And
right.
I think that's where a lot of healing comes in, is people are no longer, they start trading something's wrong with me. Oh, my heart is beating really fast while I'm in the cafeteria. Something's wrong with me, versus, oh, my body's telling me something.
Right.
What's the narrative that I'm going to create around this experience instead?
And it's perfectly normal, and your feelings are absolutely valid. And I love that you said that what we're creating around it is what's not fact, but the feeling is real, and that experience is real, and what's going on in your brain with the chemicals, that's real. And it should be validated, but also addressed. It shouldn't be, I think we too live in a world of toxic positivity where it's like, you validate a little bit too much, and it's like, okay to feel that way, but you do nothing to correct it. And
Right.
it's not that there's something wrong or bad, or like, oh, you need to be corrected, but it's not healthy for you to feel that way all of the time. You don't want to feel that way. If it's a negative emotion, or what we perceive as a negative emotion, we don't want to feel sad all of the time. We don't want to feel depressed. We don't want to feel anxious. So saying it's okay to feel that way, and just making that okay okay, well, what's the end point? Like, when do you get to stop feeling that way? Or what steps do you take to correct that so that you can live a happier life, or, at least a more comfortable life? And I think we over validate things a little bit too much in today's society, because everything's okay and everything's great and everything's human experience. And in reality, that's not, and it's not helpful, and it's not helpful to other humans around you either.
Right.
Wow. We've been going over an hour.
I know this has been amazing. I mean, I could talk, I think all three of us, because we all nerd out
Yeah,
about all
this
of
is
this.
my
We could talk about
hyperfixation
this.
subject for sure. Yeah.
And one leads to the other, and then you're like, oh, let's diet. Oh my God. Like, we're going to have to come back on for a whole like postpartum thing, because that to me is so interesting.
Yeah, I actually haven't finished it, but I've done a lot of research. It's like, I'm one of those people, just to lighten a little bit, like I'm definitely fall into that category of people that loves to watch murder mystery and listen to murder mystery podcasts and like true crime. I totally fall into that. It's almost like stress relieving, which is crazy. I'm only comfortable saying that because I know there's other people that feel that way. But um, to watch all of the murder mystery thing. Well, I watched one recently about the woman that it's just so terrible to say, but the woman that killed her children. And it sent me down this like deep dive of like, why? Because that's not, you're so bonded as a woman with your children, if normally you would never, you could never do that. Because I lost a child myself, so I'm like, why would you do that? What's then? Now I want to psychoanalyze what's going on in your brain. So I literally went down the longest rabbit hole of like postpartum case studies and all of this stuff, and I came to the conclusion that nobody, and anything that I read, at least not anything that I have found so far, correlates the oxytocin levels, the bond in pregnancy with childbirth, in the immediately bond. So then I went through all throughout history of women that have done this, because this is not I mean, we've heard about this forever. And it's a very similar, you start to see a very similar pattern of what's happening and why this ends up happening. And it sent me down a whole postpartum. So now I'm hyper fixated on postpartum, what's happening and what's going on with the chemicals and how it can be prevented and treated in the future, versus just calling it depression, giving them some medication, not understanding what's really going on in their brain, and throwing this at them and say, oh, you're just, this is normal, you're just depressed, and let's talk about it. And none of that, let's be open about it and let's talk about it, but none of that's actually helping you. And you're missing a big piece there. And people will talk about it and still be very silent because it's not helping them, but they feel like it should, and they feel like they should tell other people that it's helping them. And then it just continues to get worse. And I'm like, why don't we try to understand what's going on so we can offer some real help?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think another really interesting piece of that for me is the labor experience in general, and how that influences your postpartum experience, the
Yep.
labor and delivery care, and the influence of medications in that experience. And it's interesting because when you go into labor and delivery, you have a set of clinical team constantly, in and out and in and out, and then chart is closed. And then you go and you have a totally new chart for postpartum care. And there's no interconnectedness
Nope.
between that. There's no viewing, and there's just no studies, and there's no studies that support women's experience and validating women's voice in that. And yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
And it blew my mind. I think we did probably a whole nother episode we could do on PPD. But another thing that blew my mind is that America is one of the most unsafest countries to have a baby in. And I'm like, that, I was like, there's no way. I don't believe it. It absolutely is one of the most unsafest because of the way that we handle labor and delivery.
Yeah.
Like,
It's Well, I'll probably have to reach out to you because this, like, I'm holding back so much right now
Right,
because
right.
there's
We're
just,
gonna
I
end
have
up into a
just
whole
on my
nother
own.
episode of podcast. Like three
Yeah,
people with
just,
ADHD having a conversation. It's just gonna go. It's gonna go where it
yeah.
goes.
And just, there's so much I could say on this subject. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna, is there any closing words that you want
Do
to
you have any
say or
closing
anything?
comments? I
Just
feel like Daisy and I kind
thank
of took
you,
over.
thank you to both of you. I think this will be very beneficial in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna go ahead and just